Welcome to Myths of the Night. Ancient stories told in whispers to guide you into calm and peaceful rest. Here, the myths of old are retold in calm voices to help you rest, reflect, and dream. In the golden age of ancient Greece, when gods walked among mortals, and the line between the divine and the earthly blurred like morning mist over the Eurotas River, there unfolded a love story so profound, so achingly beautiful, that it would echo through the millennia. This is not a tale of conquest or triumph, but of connection and catastrophe, of a love that burned as bright as the sun itself, and ended in a tragedy that would stain the earth purple with grief. This is the story of Apollo and Hyacinthus, a god and a prince whose bond transcended the boundaries between immortal and mortal, only to be severed by forces beyond even divine control. Close your eyes and imagine ancient Sparta, not yet the militaristic power it would become, but a verdant valley cradled between mountains, where the river ran clear and the air was sweet with the scent of wild herbs. This was a time before endless wars, before rigid discipline defined Spartan identity. This was a gentler Sparta, where beauty was celebrated alongside strength, where young princes could dream beneath olive trees, and where the gods took more than a passing interest in mortal affairs. It was into this world that our story begins, with a prince whose beauty would capture the heart of the most radiant of all the Olympian gods. The ancient Greeks understood something profound about love that we sometimes forget in our modern world. They knew that love was not a single, simple emotion, but a force of nature, as powerful and unpredictable as the sea, as warming and dangerous as fire. They had many words for love, each describing a different facet of this most complex of human experiences. And they knew, perhaps better than we do, that the greatest loves often end in the deepest sorrows, that beauty and tragedy are forever intertwined, like the threads of the fates themselves. The story of Apollo and Hyacinthus embodies this ancient wisdom, this understanding that to love deeply is to risk devastating loss, and yet the love itself makes that risk worthwhile. But before we can understand the magnitude of this tragedy, we must first meet our protagonists, must come to know them not as distant figures from mythology, but as beings who loved and laughed, who shared moments of joy so pure they seemed to make time itself stand still. We must understand what made their connection so special, so worthy of remembrance across thousands of years. We must walk with them through sun-drenched days of companionship, Watch as a god set aside his divine responsibilities for the simple pleasure of mortal company. Witness a young prince discovering that he was capable of capturing the attention of immortality itself. Apollo, the god of light and longing. Apollo was unlike any other god on Mount Olympus, where Zeus wielded thunderbolts and demanded worship through fear, where Ares reveled in blood and chaos. Apollo represented something more complex, more nuanced. He was the god of light, yes, but also of music, healing, prophecy, and truth. He was the patron of poets and physicians, the protector of young men, the leader of the muses themselves. His domains were vast and varied, reflecting a deity of profound complexity and contradictions. Picture him as the ancient Greeks did, eternally young, beardless, the very embodiment of the kouros, that idealized youth that represented perfection of both body and spirit. His hair was golden, catching and reflecting light, as if he carried the sun within him. His form was athletic, but not brutishly muscular, graceful rather than powerful, beautiful rather than merely handsome. He moved with the fluid confidence of one who had never known doubt or limitation. And when he played his golden lyre, even the birds fell silent to listen. Even the rivers seemed to slow their rushing to better hear his melodies. But Apollo was more than just beautiful. He was brilliant, gifted with the ability to see the future through his oracle at Delphi, the most famous and respected source of prophecy in all of Greece. Kings and commoners alike would travel vast distances to hear the words spoken by his priestess, the Pythia, who channeled Apollo's knowledge of things to come. He could heal the most grievous wounds with his knowledge of herbs and medicine, yet he could also bring plague and death with his silver arrows. He was a god of contradictions, of healing and harm, of distance and intimacy, of harsh truth and beautiful lies told through poetry. Among the Olympians, Apollo held a special place. He was the son of Zeus and the Titaness, Leto, born on the floating island of Delos, along with his twin sister Artemis. His birth itself was legendary, occurring only after Leto had wandered the earth for 9 days and nights, seeking a place to deliver her children while fleeing the jealous wrath of Hera. When Apollo was born, the island of Delos suddenly became fixed in place, anchored by the weight of his divine presence. Within days of his birth, fed on ambrosia and nectar, he had grown to full maturity and killed the monstrous serpent Python that had tormented his mother, claiming the site of Delphi as his own. But what made Apollo truly unique among the gods was his capacity for love. Not the fleeting lusts that characterized so many divine romances, not the conquests and seductions that filled the stories of Zeus or Poseidon, but genuine, soul-deep connection. When Apollo loved, he loved with an intensity that could make him abandon everything else. He would set aside his lyre, neglect his bow, even forsake his sacred duties at Delphi, all for the chance to spend time with the object of his affection. His loves were legendary, though not always happy. He had pursued the nymph Daphne with desperate passion, only to have her transformed into a laurel tree to escape him, leaving him to crown himself with her leaves in eternal remembrance. He had loved the beautiful Coronis, only to kill her in a fit of jealous rage when he learned of her infidelity. These experiences had marked him, had taught him about the pain that comes with caring deeply for others. Perhaps this is why his love for Hyacinthus would be different, more tender, more willing to simply exist in the moment rather than trying to possess or control. Apollo understood music not just as sound, but as the fundamental harmony of the universe. When he played his lyre, he wasn't just making pleasant noises. He was expressing the mathematical perfection underlying all of creation, the patterns that governed the movements of the stars and the changing of the seasons. This understanding of harmony extended to his relationships. With Hyacinthus, he found a different kind of music, a harmony of spirits that required no instrument, a melody composed of shared laughter and comfortable silences. As the god of prophecy, Apollo could see the future, could trace the threads of fate as they wove their inexorable patterns. This gift, usually a source of power, became a curse in matters of the heart. Did he know, even as he fell in love with the Spartan prince, how the story would end? Did he see the blood and the flowers even as he first glimpsed that extraordinary beauty? If he did, he chose to love anyway, chose to embrace joy even with the knowledge of impending sorrow. This, perhaps, is the greatest evidence of the depth of his feeling, that even with foreknowledge of tragedy, he could not resist the pull of his heart. Apollo was also associated with the Hyperboreans, a mythical people said to live in a land of eternal spring far to the north, where the sun never set and sorrow was unknown. According to legend, Apollo would spend the winter months among them, bringing his music and light to their perfect land. Some scholars believe this connection to a place of eternal youth and beauty made Apollo especially drawn to mortals who embodied those same qualities, who seemed to carry within them a spark of that immortal perfection. Hyacinthus, with his extraordinary beauty and vibrant youth, must have seemed to Apollo like a piece of Hyperborea made flesh, a living reminder of that perfect land. But Apollo was not just a distant, ethereal deity. He was also intensely physical, delighting in athletic contests, in hunting expeditions through rugged mountains, in the simple pleasures of physical exertion and bodily excellence. The Greeks understood that the divine was not separate from the physical, but expressed through it. Apollo's appreciation of beauty was not merely aesthetic, but deeply embodied. When he looked at Hyacinthus, he saw not just a beautiful face, but the perfection of movement, the grace of an athlete, the vitality of youth in its prime. This, then, was the god who would fall in love with a Spartan prince, complex and contradictory, passionate and prophetic, capable of both terrible violence and exquisite tenderness. He was a god who understood that beauty was fleeting, that all mortal things must fade. And yet he chose to love a mortal anyway, knowing that the pain of loss was the price of genuine connection. In this, perhaps, Apollo was the most human of all the gods. For what is more fundamentally human than to love something you know you cannot keep, to cherish what you know must pass away? Hyacinthus, beauty that captivated heaven. In the heart of ancient Sparta, in the town of Amyclae, there lived a prince whose beauty was so extraordinary that it seemed to bend the very air around him, as if light itself was drawn to his presence and reluctant to leave. His name was Hyacinthus, and from the moment of his birth, it was clear that the fates had woven something special into the fabric of his being. He was the youngest son of King Amyclas and Queen Diomede, daughter of Lapithes, born into a royal house that traced its lineage back to Zeus himself, making Hyacinthus the great-grandson of the king of the gods. The ancient sources speak of Hyacinthus's beauty in terms usually reserved for the gods themselves. His hair was dark and lustrous, falling in curls that the Greeks described as hyacinthine, resembling the coiled petals of the flower that would later bear his name. Some writers suggest these curls were so dark they appeared almost purple in certain light, like the deep violet of twilight. His eyes held depths that seemed to reflect the clarity of Spartan skies, and his features possessed a symmetry that ancient Greeks believed indicated not just physical perfection, but moral excellence as well. In their understanding, true beauty was never merely superficial, but reflected an inner harmony of spirit. But Hyacinthus was more than just a pretty face, more than just another beautiful youth in a land that celebrated physical perfection. He possessed an athletic prowess that matched his appearance excelling in all the sports and competitions that were so central to Spartan culture. He could run like the wind itself, his feet seeming barely to touch the ground. He wrestled with strength that belied his graceful form. He could throw a discus with both power and precision. And his aim with a javelin was true enough to bring down swift game in the mountains. In the palaestra, the training grounds where young Spartan men honed their bodies, Hyacinthus stood out not through brute force, but through an innate grace, a natural athleticism that made even the most difficult feats appear effortless. Growing up in the royal house of Sparta, Hyacinthus was surrounded by siblings, brothers Sinortus, Argolus, and Harpalus, and sisters Polyboia, Laodamia, and Hegesandra. Some traditions even name the famous Daphne as his sister, creating a strange parallel where both siblings would become eternally connected to Apollo, though in vastly different ways. Among all these children of Amyclas, Hyacinthus was known as the youngest and the most beautiful, the favorite not just of his parents, but of all who knew him. From his earliest years, Hyacinthus attracted attention wherever he went. Spartan mothers would sing of his beauty to their own children, holding him up as an ideal to aspire to. Spartan fathers praised the strength in his young arms, seeing in him the promise of future glory for their city. But this attention did not make Hyacinthus arrogant or aloof. By all accounts, he possessed a gentleness of spirit, a warmth that made him beloved not just for his appearance, but for his character. He was known to be kind to servants and commoners, respectful to elders, loyal to friends. In him, the Greek ideal of kolokagathia, the unity of physical beauty and moral goodness, seemed to find perfect expression. It wasn't just mortals who noticed Hyacinthus. The gods themselves, always drawn to extraordinary beauty, could not help but be aware of this remarkable youth. The wind god Zephyrus, who commanded the gentle western breezes, looked down from his aerial realm and felt his heart stirred by desire. Boreas, the fierce north wind, was said to have coveted him as well. Even among mortals, Hyacinthus had admirers. A man named Thamyris, himself a legendary figure, as reportedly the first man to have loved another man, was said to have been captivated by the young prince. Hyacinthus existed in a constellation of desire, at the center of multiple would-be lovers, each hoping to claim some part of his affection. But Hyacinthus's life was not defined solely by others' desires for him. He had his own interests, his own passions. He loved the land of Sparta itself, the way the morning mist would rise from the Eurotas River, the wild beauty of Mount Taygetus that loomed over the valley. He enjoyed long walks in the olive groves, the simple pleasure of good wine shared with friends, the songs and stories told at evening gatherings. He was curious about the world beyond Sparta, about the gods and their mysteries, about music and poetry and all the things that elevated life beyond mere survival. When he trained in the palaestra, anointing his body with olive oil, as was the custom, preparing for athletic contests, Hyacinthus moved with a confidence that came not from vanity, but from perfect control of his physical form. Other young men watched him, some with envy, others with admiration, all with recognition that they were witnessing something exceptional. The elders of Sparta spoke of him as a youth who would bring honor to their city, who embodied the best qualities of their people: courage without cruelty, strength tempered with wisdom, beauty that reflected inner virtue. In the social world of ancient Sparta, relationships between older men and younger youths were not uncommon and were often seen as educational, a way for experienced men to mentor and guide the next generation. But what Hyacinthus would find with Apollo transcended these conventional arrangements. This would be no mere mentorship or traditional relationship, but something that defied easy categorization, a bond that would prove deep enough to make a god abandon his responsibilities, intense enough to inspire jealousy in other immortals, and tragic enough to be remembered for thousands of years. Hyacinthus was at that perfect age, poised between boyhood and manhood, when youth burns at its brightest. He had the strength and skill of a man, but retained the openness and wonder of a boy not yet hardened by the world. He could compete with the best athletes, but still laugh with genuine delight at a well-told joke. He was serious enough to understand responsibility, but young enough to embrace joy without reservation. It was this combination, perhaps, that made him so irresistible, this sense of someone standing at the very peak of youth, before age or experience could dim any of his radiance. The name Hyacinthus itself is ancient, predating even the Greek language as we know it. The "-enth suffix suggests pre-Hellenic origins, linking the prince to peoples and cultures that existed before the Greeks arrived in the Mediterranean. Some scholars believe that Hyacinthus may originally have been a minor vegetation deity, a spirit of the spring, whose story was later humanized and incorporated into Greek mythology. This would explain the deep connection between Hyacinthus and the cycle of seasons, the way his story speaks to themes of death and rebirth, of beauty that fades but returns again each spring. But whether or not Hyacinthus had divine origins, in the story as it comes down to us, he is decidedly mortal, possessing all the vulnerability and all the precious impermanence that mortality entails. He could be wounded, he could suffer, he could die. And it is precisely this mortality that would make his story so poignant. For Apollo would discover that all his divine power, all his healing knowledge, all his mastery of so many arts, could not save the one he loved from the inevitable end that comes to all mortal things. This was Hyacinthus, beautiful beyond measure, athletic and graceful, kind-hearted and noble, beloved by many, but belonging fully to none, living his life in the sun-drenched valley of Sparta, not knowing that his days were numbered, not knowing that his beauty had already caught the attention of the most radiant god on Olympus, not knowing that he was about to become part of a love story that would echo through eternity. When divine met mortal, the beginning of love. The sources do not give us precise details of how Apollo first saw Hyacinthus, but we can imagine it, can picture that moment when the divine and the mortal first locked eyes, and something shifted in the very fabric of fate. Perhaps Apollo was riding across the sky in his chariot drawn by swans, those graceful birds sacred to him, symbols of music and poetry. Perhaps he looked down at Sparta, as he often did, keeping watch over the land, and there, in the Palaestra, or along the banks of the Eurotas, he saw a youth who seemed to capture and reflect his own light. Or perhaps it happened more intimately, more subtly. Apollo often walked among mortals, taking pleasure in observing their lives, occasionally offering guidance or inspiration. He might have come to Sparta for one of its festivals, might have stood among the crowd, watching the young men compete, and there have seen Hyacinthus, moving with that particular grace that sets certain individuals apart, that makes them seem to exist in a slightly different realm than everyone around them. However it happened, one thing is certain. Apollo fell in love. Not with the casual interest that characterized so many divine affairs, not with the passing fancy that could be satisfied and forgotten, but with a depth of feeling that would fundamentally change him. Ancient sources are clear on this point. Apollo loved Hyacinthus above all others. The love he felt for this Spartan prince exceeded anything he had felt for previous lovers, mortal or immortal. It was a love that would make him abandon Delphi, the very center of his worship, the place where he spoke to mortals and guided their fates. It was a love that would make him set aside his golden lyre and his silver bow, the very symbols of his divine identity, to simply be with the object of his affection. What exactly did Apollo love about Hyacinthus? Certainly, the physical beauty played a role. The Greeks did not apologize for appreciating physical perfection. They saw it as a reflection of divine favor, an outward sign of inner excellence. But Apollo's love went deeper than surface attraction. He loved Hyacinthus's spirit, his enthusiasm for life, his openness to new experiences. He loved the way the young prince approached each day with fresh wonder, the way he could find joy in simple things, the way he laughed without reservation. He loved the eagerness with which Hyacinthus learned, the quickness of his mind, the depths of his potential. And Hyacinthus, for his part, was equally captivated. To have the attention of Apollo, the most beautiful and accomplished of all the gods, would have been overwhelming. But Hyacinthus did not approach this divine favor with fear or trembling. Instead, he met Apollo as something close to an equal, at least in terms of the relationship they built. He was not a worshipper seeking favors from a deity, but a companion, sharing experiences with someone he genuinely cared for. This must have been refreshingly different for Apollo, who was so often approached with supplication and fear, who was rarely treated simply as a person rather than as a god to be appeased. The beginning of their relationship was marked by Apollo's complete devotion. He essentially abandoned his divine responsibilities to be with Hyacinthus. Delphi, which should have had Apollo as its presiding guardian, went unattended. The oracle fell silent. Pilgrims who had traveled from across the Greek world seeking prophecy found the sanctuary empty, the god absent. This was unprecedented. Apollo had always taken his duties seriously, had always been reliable in his various roles. But now, for the first time, something mattered more to him than responsibility. Someone mattered more. Apollo came to Sparta and stayed. He frequented the Eurotas River, walking its banks with Hyacinthus, the two of them talking for hours about everything and nothing. He stayed in Sparta itself, the city that famously had no walls, that relied on the courage of its warriors rather than stone fortifications for protection. He participated in the daily life of the city, something a god rarely did for so long. He hunted in the mountains with Hyacinthus, the two of them climbing the rough slopes of Taygetus, pursuing deer and wild boar through forests where the afternoon light filtered green through the leaves. Apollo became Hyacinthus's teacher, but not in the traditional sense of divine instruction. He taught the prince to play the lyre, those beautiful fingers that could coax such sublime music from strings now guiding less skilled but eager hands. He taught him the art of prophecy, how to read signs in the flight of birds, in the movement of clouds, in the patterns of the stars. He introduced him to the Muses, those 9 divine sisters who presided over arts and sciences, and Hyacinthus learned from them as well, expanding his understanding of poetry and music, of astronomy and history. But Apollo also learned from Hyacinthus. He learned about mortal joy, about the particular sweetness that comes from knowing time is limited. Gods, in their immortality, could take infinite time for granted. But Hyacinthus lived in the immediate present, appreciating each moment because he knew, even if he didn't consciously think about it, that his moments were numbered. This mortal perspective was new to Apollo, and he found it intoxicating. Every day with Hyacinthus felt precious in a way that divine days never did. They traveled together across the lands sacred to Apollo. The god had a chariot drawn by swans, and he would take Hyacinthus on journeys to far-flung places. They visited Delos, the island of Apollo's birth, that rocky outcrop in the Aegean where the palm tree still stood under which Leto had given birth. They went to other sanctuaries and sacred groves, places where Apollo was worshipped. Hyacinthus got to see the world from a perspective no other mortal had experienced, riding through the sky with a god, looking down on mountains and seas from heights that would terrify most people, but only thrilled the adventurous young prince. In Sparta itself, their relationship became known and, remarkably, accepted. The Spartans were practical people, and if a god chose to honor their city with his presence, to lavish attention on one of their princes, they were not about to complain. Hyacinthus's family was undoubtedly both proud and perhaps a little anxious. What parent wouldn't worry about their child attracting the intense attention of an Olympian god? Divine love, as many myths demonstrated, was often dangerous for mortals. But Apollo seemed different, seemed genuinely devoted to Hyacinthus's well-being and happiness. The physical aspect of their relationship is handled delicately in most ancient sources, but it's clear that this was a romance in every sense of the word. They exercised together in the palaestra, stripping and oiling their bodies, as was the custom, engaging in wrestling and other athletic pursuits that brought them into close physical contact. They spent long summer days together, the heat of the sun matching the warmth between them. When they rested, they would lie in the grass together, Apollo perhaps playing his lyre softly while Hyacinthus listened, or the two of them simply talking, sharing their thoughts and dreams. What made their love so special, So worthy of being remembered and retold was its quality of mutual delight. There was no sense of dominance or submission, no asymmetry of power, despite the obvious difference between a god and a mortal. They were companions in the truest sense, taking joy in each other's company, supporting and encouraging each other, building something together that was greater than either of them alone. Apollo found in Hyacinthus someone who could match his enthusiasm, who could appreciate the wonders he could show, who responded to his gifts not with awe, but with genuine pleasure and curiosity. For months, perhaps years, this golden period continued. Sparta basked in the reflected glory of having Apollo in residence. The crops grew abundant, the harvests were bountiful, the people prospered. It seemed as if the presence of Apollo and the love between the god and the prince had created a bubble of perfect happiness, a space outside normal time where nothing could go wrong, where summer could last forever. But of course, it couldn't. No matter how powerful the love, no matter how bright the joy, nothing mortal can last forever. And there were others watching this happiness, others who felt their own desires thwarted by the bond between Apollo and Hyacinthus, others whose jealousy was building like storm clouds on the horizon, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The winds of jealousy. Not everyone rejoiced in the happiness of Apollo and Hyacinthus. In the realm of the gods, love was often a competitive affair, and jealousy could be as powerful a force as love itself. Among the divine beings who watched the growing bond between the sun god and the Spartan prince with increasing resentment was Zephyrus, the god of the west wind. And his feelings would ultimately prove fatal. Zephyrus was a complex deity, associated with the gentlest of winds, the warm breezes that brought spring and made flowers bloom. He was the son of Eos, goddess of dawn, and Astraeus, the Titan god of dusk and the stars. He was married to Iris, the goddess of the rainbow. But like so many gods, his marriage did not preclude other interests. He had long admired Hyacinthus from his aerial vantage point, had watched the beautiful prince as he trained and hunted, had felt a desire growing within him that had nothing to do with his official responsibilities as a wind god. Zephyrus had tried, in his own way, to court Hyacinthus. He would send particularly pleasant breezes when the prince was outside, would caress his hair with invisible fingers, would cool his sweat after athletic exertion. But these subtle attentions went largely unnoticed or unappreciated. Hyacinthus was kind when he even registered Zephyrus's presence, but he clearly felt no particular attraction to the wind god. And then Apollo had arrived, blazing and brilliant impossible to ignore, and Hyacinthus had been utterly captivated. For Zephyrus, this rejection was galling. He was a god, after all, a being of power and importance. To be passed over for another god was one thing, but to be so completely disregarded while Hyacinthus devoted himself entirely to Apollo felt like an insult. He watched as Apollo and Hyacinthus laughed together, as they hunted together, as they clearly delighted in each other's company. He saw the way Hyacinthus looked at Apollo with an admiration and affection that Zephyrus had desperately wanted directed at himself. And in his heart, dark emotions began to take root: resentment, bitterness, and finally, corrosive jealousy. Some sources also mention Boreas, the god of the north wind, Zephyrus's brother, as another divine suitor for Hyacinthus. Boreas was far fiercer than his gentle brother, associated with winter's harsh blasts, with the cold that could kill. If he also desired Hyacinthus, his frustration at being overlooked would have been even more intense, given his violent nature. But it is Zephyrus who features most prominently in the tragedy to come, perhaps because the contrast between his gentle nature and his violent action would prove so shocking. There was also Thamyris, a mortal man, a legendary singer and poet who some sources claim was the first man to love another man. If this tradition is accurate, Thamyris represented yet another rival for Hyacinthus's affections, though a mortal could hardly compete with gods for the prince's attention. Still, his presence in some versions of the story adds another layer to the theme of multiple suitors, of Hyacinthus as a figure so desirable that he attracted love from all quarters, mortal and immortal alike. But it was Zephyrus whose jealousy would prove most consequential. As he watched Apollo and Hyacinthus's relationship deepen and flourish, something broke inside him. Perhaps it was the realization that he would never have what Apollo had, that Hyacinthus would never look at him the way he looked at the sun god. Perhaps it was wounded pride, the inability to accept rejection. Whatever the cause, Zephyrus began to contemplate something terrible. If he could not have Hyacinthus, then neither should Apollo. It was the ancient logic of jealousy taken to its most extreme conclusion, the destructive impulse that says it is better to destroy what you desire than to see it possessed by another. The jealousy of gods was particularly dangerous because gods had the power to act on their emotions in ways mortals could not. Zephyrus could not simply challenge Apollo to combat. The sun god was far more powerful, far more skilled in warfare. But Zephyrus had his own powers, his mastery over air and wind. He could influence the flight of objects, could alter trajectories, could make things move in ways they otherwise would not. All he needed was an opportunity, a moment when he could act without being detected, when he could strike without revealing himself as the culprit. And so Zephyrus waited. He watched with eyes clouded by bitterness, looking for his chance. He saw Apollo and Hyacinthus engage in various athletic activities, their bodies beautiful in motion, their joy in each other's company evident in every gesture and glance. Each moment of their happiness was like a knife in his heart, each shared laugh a reminder of what he could not have. His love, thwarted and twisted, had transformed into something dark and deadly. He was no longer the gentle western breeze, but a force of destruction waiting to strike. The tragedy of Zephyrus is that his love was probably genuine, at least initially. He truly did admire Hyacinthus, truly did desire him. But he made the fatal error of confusing love with possession, of believing that his own feelings entitled him to the object of those feelings. This is a mistake that echoes through countless stories, ancient and modern. The failure to understand that love should want happiness for the beloved, even if that happiness is found with someone else. Zephyrus could not accept this. His love had curdled into something that could only find satisfaction in destruction. It's worth noting that in some versions of the story, there is no Zephyrus, no jealous rival at all. In these accounts, Hyacinthus's death is a pure accident, a tragic mischance with no malice behind it. These versions emphasize the randomness of tragedy, the way that even gods cannot always protect those they love from simple bad luck. But the version featuring Zephyrus has proven more enduring, perhaps because it speaks to something deeply human about jealousy, about the ways that thwarted desire can turn toxic, about how love denied can become murderous hatred. The stage was set for tragedy. Apollo and Hyacinthus continued their idyllic existence, unaware of the danger lurking in every breeze, not knowing that invisible eyes watched their every move with increasing malevolence. Zephyrus had made his decision. He was only waiting for the perfect moment to act, for that instant when he could strike with precision, when he could destroy Apollo's happiness while maintaining the fiction of accident. The warm days of their love affair were coming to an end, though neither of them knew it. The wind was about to change, and with it, everything would be lost. The fatal throw, a day that changed everything. The day began like so many others in that perfect time. The sun rose over Mount Taygetus, painting the peaks gold, and sending long shadows across the valley of Sparta. The air was warm, the sky cloudless. One of those ideal summer days that seem to promise that happiness can indeed last forever. Apollo and Hyacinthus woke in good spirits, eager to spend another day together, to push their bodies to their limits, and then rest in the satisfaction of physical exertion, well rewarded. They decided to practice throwing the discus, an athletic event that was central to Greek sports. The discus was a heavy disc of bronze, stone, or iron, requiring both strength and technique to throw properly. It was not a child's toy, but a serious piece of athletic equipment capable of flying impressive distances in skilled hands, and equally capable of causing terrible harm if mishandled. For a god like Apollo, the discus was practically weightless, and he could send it soaring through the air with effortless power. For Hyacinthus, though highly skilled, it required focus and strength, and he relished the challenge of trying to match Apollo's throws. They made their way to an open field, a meadow on the outskirts of Sparta, where the grass grew thick and soft. It was a place they had been many times before, a spot where they could exercise without crowds of onlookers, where they could simply be themselves without the weight of godhood and royalty constantly upon them. The location was perfect for discus throwing, flat, open, with no obstacles that might deflect or stop the heavy disc. Or so they thought. Apollo went first, as befitted his superior skill. He picked up the discus, feeling its familiar weight in his hand, appreciating the way the bronze had been polished smooth. He began to spin, building momentum, his body rotating with perfect form, every muscle working in harmony. Then, at precisely the right moment, he released, sending the discus flying through the air in a perfect arc. It climbed higher and higher, seeming to hang in the sky for a moment at the apex of its flight before beginning its descent. The throw was magnificent, easily clearing distances that would have been impossible for any mortal athlete. Hyacinthus watched with admiration and excitement. He loved watching Apollo perform feats of athleticism, loved the way the god's body moved with such controlled power. But he was not content to simply observe. He wanted to participate, wanted to show Apollo that he too had skill, even if he couldn't match divine prowess. As the discus completed its flight and landed far across the meadow, Hyacinthus eagerly ran to retrieve it, calling out his intention to try to match Apollo's throw. The sources tell us that Apollo cautioned him to be careful, but in the playful way of lovers, not with any real sense of danger. After all, what danger could there be? They had done this countless times before. Apollo was in complete control of his throws. The day was perfect, calm, with barely a breeze stirring the grass. What could possibly go wrong? Hyacinthus picked up the discus, feeling its weight, measuring in his mind the force he would need to apply. He had learned much from Apollo about proper technique, about the rotation and the release, about following through with the whole body. He positioned himself, began his spin, built up momentum, and released. The discus flew, not as far as Apollo's had gone, but still an impressive throw, one any mortal athlete would have been proud of. It arced through the air, and both Apollo and Hyacinthus watched its flight with satisfaction. But something terrible happened. The most commonly told version of the story, found in the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphoses, describes what happened next as a pure and horrifying accident. Hyacinthus, eager and excited, ran to catch the discus as it descended. But the heavy disc struck the hard earth and bounded back up with unexpected force, ricocheting in a way no one could have predicted. The bronze discus flew upward and struck Hyacinthus directly in the face with devastating impact. However, another version of this tale exists, one that adds a darker layer to the tragedy. In some tellings, preserved by ancient writers like Lucian, it was not mere accident, but jealousy that caused this catastrophe. Zephyrus, the god of the west wind, who had loved Hyacinthus and been rejected, had been watching from his invisible aerial realm. As the discus arced through the air, Zephyrus sent a gust of wind to redirect its path, deliberately guiding it toward the unsuspecting prince. Whether by chance or by malice, the result was the same. In that split second, time seemed to slow for Apollo. His prophetic sense, which he had perhaps been suppressing in his happiness, suddenly screamed a warning. He saw what was about to happen, saw the trajectory of the bronze disc, saw Hyacinthus standing exactly where it would strike. He tried to shout a warning, tried to move, tried to use his divine power to alter the course of events. But it was too late. Everything was happening too fast. The discus struck Hyacinthus with terrible force. The impact was horrific. The sound of bronze against flesh and bone sickeningly loud in the quiet meadow. Hyacinthus dropped immediately, crumpling to the ground like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Blood began to flow, dark and terrible, against the green grass and the prince's pale skin. The beautiful face that had captivated a god was suddenly marked by the wound. The injury clearly catastrophic. Apollo was at his side in an instant, moving faster than thought, gathering Hyacinthus into his arms. The god's hands, which had wielded bow and lyre with such mastery, now trembled as they tried to stop the bleeding, tried to assess the damage. And what he saw filled him with a horror he had never experienced before. The wound was mortal. The skull was fractured, the injury catastrophic. Even as Apollo watched, life was draining from Hyacinthus's eyes. "No," Apollo whispered, then louder, "No!" His voice, which could command oracles and inspire prophecies, now cracked with desperation. He pressed his hands to the wound, trying to channel his healing powers, the same abilities that had made him the patron god of medicine. But the injury was too severe. Or perhaps it was fate itself that made his powers useless. Nothing he did slowed the bleeding. Nothing he tried brought back the light that was fading from those beautiful eyes. Hyacinthus, dying, looked up at Apollo. Even in his agony, there was no accusation in his gaze, only sadness. He tried to speak, perhaps to comfort the god who loved him, perhaps to say goodbye, but the words wouldn't come. His hand reached up to touch Apollo's face, a final gesture of affection. And then it fell. The life went out of his eyes like a candle being snuffed. And he was gone. Apollo held the body and screamed. It was a sound of pure anguish, a god's grief made manifest. The cry echoed across the valley, reached the city of Sparta, flew up to Olympus itself. Birds took flight in terror, animals fled, and mortals who heard it felt their blood run cold. It was the sound of a god discovering that all his power, all his knowledge, all his divine abilities meant nothing in the face of death. He could not heal this wound. He could not call back the departed soul. He could not undo what had been done. In the sky above, if the version with Zephyrus is to be believed, the west wind watched unseen. He had done exactly what he intended, had used his power over air to redirect the discus mid-flight, turning an athletic exercise into a lethal weapon. He had his revenge. Apollo's happiness was destroyed. Hyacinthus was dead. And from Zephyrus's twisted perspective, a kind of justice had been served. But in the version without divine interference, there was no villain, no one to blame, only the terrible randomness of fate, the way that joy can turn to tragedy in a single heartbeat through no one's fault at all. Apollo remained in that meadow for hours, holding the cooling body of his beloved, refusing to accept what had happened. He tried again and again to heal the wound, to restart the stopped heart, to breathe life back into the lifeless lungs. he called upon all his powers, invoked his father Zeus, begged for help from anyone who might hear. But the laws of mortality are absolute. What dies cannot simply be brought back, not even by the most powerful of gods. There are boundaries that even the Olympians cannot cross, rules woven into the fabric of reality by the fates themselves. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors that seemed to mock the tragedy below with their beauty, Apollo finally accepted what he could not change. Hyacinthus was dead. The beautiful prince, the companion of his heart, the mortal who had made him feel more alive than centuries of godhood, was gone. The body in his arms was already growing cold, already beginning the process of decay that claims all mortal flesh. But Apollo was still a god, and gods do not accept endings easily. If he could not bring Hyacinthus back to life, perhaps he could ensure that the prince would not be forgotten, that his beauty and their love would be remembered forever. As Apollo's tears fell onto the blood-stained grass where Hyacinthus lay, as his grief poured out in waves of divine sorrow, something began to happen. The blood soaking into the earth began to glow with a faint light. The grass around the body began to stir, though there was still no wind. Apollo recognized what was happening, what his grief and power were combining to create. This was transformation, metamorphosis. The same magic that had turned Daphne into a laurel tree, that had changed so many mortals caught up in divine affairs into animals, plants, or natural features. Hyacinthus could not live again as a man, but perhaps he could exist in another form, could bloom anew each year as a reminder of what had been lost and what was still cherished. Apollo placed his hands on the earth where Hyacinthus's blood had spilled, pouring his power and his love into the ground. "You shall not be forgotten," he promised the silent body. "Your beauty will return with each spring, and all who see it will remember that once there was a prince so extraordinary that even a god loved him." And from that blood-soaked earth, a flower began to grow. It pushed up through the soil with supernatural speed, its stem strong and straight, its leaves a vibrant green. At the top, a cluster of buds formed and then opened, revealing petals of the deepest purple, almost black in their intensity, the color of Hyacinthus's hair, the color of twilight, the color of morning. The flower was beautiful and strange, its petals curling back in a way that some said resembled curls of hair, its color rich and unlike any flower that had grown before. Apollo looked at the flower through eyes blurred with tears. on its petals he saw marks that looked like letters, like the Greek words Ai, Ai, a cry of lament, an expression of grief that needed no translation. Some sources say that Apollo inscribed these letters himself, using his divine power to mark the flower forever with his sorrow. Others say that the marks appeared naturally, that the flower itself was born from grief, and so carried that emotion in its very form. Either way, the hyacinth flower, as it would come to be called, was forever marked with mourning. But the transformation was not only botanical. Apollo also ensured that Hyacinthus would receive honors, that his memory would be celebrated rather than simply mourned. He decreed that the people of Sparta would hold annual festivals in Hyacinthus's name, that they would remember the beautiful prince with games and sacrifices and songs. He established the Hyacinthia, a festival that would last for 3 days each summer, blending mourning for the dead prince with celebration of his life, and the ongoing renewal represented by his flower. Some traditions hold that Apollo did something more, that he elevated Hyacinthus's spirit to a kind of immortality. Perhaps not full godhood, but a blessed existence in the Elysian fields, or even on Olympus itself, where the beautiful youth could dwell in comfort and peace. Other versions say that Hyacinthus became a minor deity associated with vegetation and the spring. His death and rebirth each year mirroring the death and rebirth of crops. The details vary, but the underlying theme is consistent. Apollo used his power to ensure that Hyacinthus, though dead as a mortal man, would continue to exist in some form, would not simply fade into the nothingness that claimed most human souls. As night fell on that terrible day, Apollo finally lifted Hyacinthus's body in his arms and carried it back to Sparta. The people who saw the god's face, streaked with tears, bloody from cradling the wounded prince, knew immediately that something terrible had happened. The news spread through the city like wildfire. Hyacinthus was dead. The beautiful prince, beloved of Apollo, had fallen in a tragic accident. The grief was universal. Hyacinthus had been loved by his people, and his loss was mourned by all Sparta. King Amyclas and Queen Diomede received their son's body with the stunned disbelief of parents confronted with every parent's worst nightmare. Apollo stayed with them, offering what comfort he could, which was precious little. How do you console mortals for a loss you yourself cannot accept? He told them of the flower, of the honors he would establish, of his intention to ensure that Hyacinthus would never be forgotten. But these things, while meaningful, could not fill the void left by the death of a beloved child. The funeral was magnificent, befitting a prince and the beloved of a god. Apollo himself played the lament on his lyre, a melody so beautiful and so sad that everyone who heard it wept, even those who had not known Hyacinthus personally. The music captured everything: the joy of their love, the shock of the loss, the permanence of death, and the desperate desire to undo what could not be undone. It was perhaps the most perfect piece of music Apollo had ever created, born from genuine emotion rather than mere technical skill. And in the days and weeks that followed, the hyacinth flowers began to appear all across the region. They grew wild in the meadows, pushed up through cracks in stone walls, appeared in gardens and on hillsides. It was as if Hyacinthus himself was returning, not as he had been, but transformed, beautifying the land that had been his home. The people gathered these flowers, wove them into garlands, placed them on graves and at shrines, understanding that they were not just flowers, but living memorials to a love that had transcended even death. The eternal memorial, the Hyacinthia festival. In the aftermath of tragedy, humanity has always sought ways to memorialize the lost, to ensure that those who have died are not forgotten, that their lives continue to have meaning and impact even after death. For Hyacinthus, this memorialization took the form of one of ancient Sparta's most important religious festivals, the Hyacinthia. Established by Apollo himself and maintained by the Spartans for centuries, this 3-day celebration represented a remarkable fusion of mourning and joy, of death and renewal, becoming one of the most significant events in the Spartan religious calendar. The Hyacinthia was celebrated annually in the Spartan month of Hecatombius, which roughly corresponds to late May through July in our modern calendar during the early summer season. The timing varied somewhat in ancient sources, but it was consistently associated with the heat of summer, when flowers would droop under the sun's intensity. The festival took place at Amyclae, the very town where Hyacinthus had been born and raised, where his tomb would become a sacred site. What made the Hyacinthia unique among Greek festivals was its dual nature. The first day was devoted entirely to mourning and lamentation, a day of genuine grief that honored the tragedy of Hyacinthus's death. During this day, the Spartans observed strict customs of mourning. No crowns of flowers were worn, despite flowers being a typical feature of Greek festivals. No hymns of joy were sung, no paeans of celebration. Even the consumption of certain foods was restricted. It was a day of fasting and somber reflection, a day when the entire city remembered that their beautiful prince had died young, that even divine love could not protect against mortality. The centerpiece of this first day's observance was ritual lamentation at the tomb of Hyacinthus, which was located beneath the throne of the great cult statue of Apollo at Amyclae. This placement was deeply symbolic, literally positioning Hyacinthus beneath Apollo, suggesting both his death and his enduring connection to the god. The tomb was decorated with images of Hyacinthus being carried up to heaven, artistic representations of his deification or his transport to the blessed afterlife. During the festival's first day, libations were poured into the tomb through special openings, offerings made to the departed prince as if to a hero or a minor deity. Women played a significant role in these mourning rituals, as was common in Greek culture, where women were often the primary mourners at funerals and memorial services. They would sing dirges, songs of lamentation that told the story of Hyacinthus's beauty and his tragic death. These songs were passed down through generations, keeping the memory of the prince alive centuries after his death. The melodies were mournful, using particular musical modes associated with grief and loss, and the lyrics emphasized the injustice of such beauty being cut down in its prime, the cruelty of fate that would take someone so beloved. But after this day of mourning, the festival's character completely transformed. The second and third days were devoted to joyous celebration, to honoring not Hyacinthus's death, but his life, and the promise of renewal represented by his transformation into the flower. This dramatic shift from grief to celebration might seem jarring to modern sensibilities, but it reflected a profound Greek understanding of the relationship between death and life, endings and new beginnings. The mourning was real and necessary, but it did not define the whole of Hyacinthus's story. His beauty lived on in the flowers. His memory lived on in the hearts of those who celebrated. And through Apollo's intervention, his spirit had achieved a kind of immortality. On these celebratory days, the restrictions of the first day were completely reversed. Now crowns and garlands were worn, woven from hyacinth flowers when they were in bloom, or from other flowers at other times. Music filled the air, not the lamentations of the first day, but triumphant hymns praising Apollo and celebrating the ongoing cycle of life and death that Hyacinthus represented. A special hymn called a paean was sung, a type of song associated specifically with Apollo, expressing joy and thanksgiving to the god who had honored Sparta with his presence and who continued to watch over the city. The second and third days featured elaborate processions, massive public gatherings that demonstrated the importance of this festival to Spartan society. Young men and women participated, the men wearing military equipment that displayed their readiness for war, the women dressed in beautiful garments that showcased their status and their family's wealth. They would process through the streets of Amyclae and up to the sanctuary of Apollo, bringing offerings to the god, animals for sacrifice, dedications of various kinds, and always, when available, hyacinth flowers. Athletic competitions formed a crucial part of the celebration, connecting the festival to Hyacinthus's own love of athletic excellence and to the circumstances of his death. Young men competed in running races, wrestling matches, and other contests. The discus throw was notably included, despite, or perhaps because, of its tragic association with Hyacinthus's death. By continuing to practice and honor this sport, the Spartans acknowledged that the tool of tragedy could also be an instrument of glory, that life must continue even after terrible loss. Musical competitions were equally important, reflecting Apollo's identity as the god of music and the arts. Performers would compete on the lyre and with songs, trying to capture something of the beauty that Apollo himself could create. Choruses of boys would sing special songs composed for the occasion, their young voices meant to echo the eternal youth of Hyacinthus. These performances were not just entertainment, but religious offerings, ways of honoring both Apollo and the memory of the prince he had loved. The festival also included massive communal feasts, occasions when social hierarchies were somewhat relaxed, and people from all levels of Spartan society could come together. Special foods were prepared, including Shian offerings that were ritually shared between the human participants and the gods. Animals were sacrificed at Apollo's altar, their meat distributed among the celebrants, creating a sense of community and shared participation in the sacred. These feasts were occasions for storytelling, when the older generation would recount to the younger the tale of Apollo and Hyacinthus, ensuring that the story was passed down intact. One particularly interesting aspect of the Hyacinthia was the participation of the Amyclaean maidens. These young women would perform ritual dances and songs, riding in special carts called canas that were crafted specifically for the festival. They wore elaborate garments and sang songs that had been preserved for generations. Their performance, a living link to the ancient past, when Hyacinthus had walked the same streets, when Apollo had been physically present in the city. The festival was so important to Spartan identity that even military campaigns were interrupted to observe it. Historical records show that Spartan armies on campaign would observe a sacred truce to celebrate the Hyacinthia, with soldiers returning home if possible, or conducting abbreviated versions of the festival wherever they happened to be. This demonstrates the profound significance of the event. For the famously militaristic Spartans, to prioritize a religious festival over warfare shows just how central the Hyacinthia was to their sense of themselves as a people. The sanctuary at Amyclae, where the festival centered, was itself a remarkable structure. The throne of Apollo, beneath which Hyacinthus's tomb was located, was an enormous monument, considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. It was created by the sculptor Bathycles of Magnesia in the 6th century BCE and stood about 45 feet high. The throne was not actually a functional seat, but rather a massive architectural structure, elaborately decorated with mythological scenes, including representations of Hyacinthus himself. The structure was designed so that ritual offerings could be poured directly into Hyacinthus's tomb through special channels, allowing the living to maintain an ongoing relationship with the dead prince. The cult statue of Apollo at Amyclae showed the god in an archaic style, helmeted and armed, a representation that emphasized Apollo's martial aspects rather than his more commonly depicted youthful beauty. This choice reflected the Spartan character, their appreciation for military prowess alongside artistic excellence. But even in this martial representation, Apollo's connection to Hyacinthus was maintained through the placement of the statue directly over the prince's tomb, the god eternally standing guard over his beloved. The Hyacinthia continued to be celebrated for centuries well into the Roman period, adapting to changing political circumstances, but maintaining its core identity as a memorial to the love between a god and a mortal. Even as Greece was conquered by Macedon and then Rome, even as the old gods were gradually supplanted by Christianity, the memory of Hyacinthus persisted in Sparta. The festival eventually faded away with the decline of paganism, but its legacy remained in the stories passed down through literature and art. What made the Hyacinthia so enduring was its emotional honesty. It did not try to sanitize or simplify the story it commemorated. The first day's mourning acknowledged that Hyacinthus's death was a genuine tragedy, that loss is real and deserves to be grieved. But the following day's celebrations recognized that life continues, that beauty can arise from tragedy, that memory itself is a form of immortality. This balanced approach to death and renewal resonated deeply with the Greek psyche and made the festival meaningful across generations. The festival also served important social functions beyond its religious significance. It was an occasion for the Spartan community to come together, for families to reunite, for young people to socialize, and display themselves to potential marriage partners. The athletic competitions allowed young men to prove their worth and gain recognition. The musical performances provided opportunities for artistic expression in a society often viewed as being primarily focused on military training. In these ways, the Hyacinthia enriched Spartan life, providing a counterbalance to the harsh discipline and austerity that otherwise characterized their culture. Through the Hyacinthia, Apollo ensured that his beloved would never be forgotten, that Hyacinthus's name would be spoken with reverence and affection for as long as Sparta endured. It was perhaps the most lasting gift the god could give. This guarantee of memory, this transformation of private grief into public commemoration. Every year, when the Spartans gathered to honor Hyacinthus, they were participating in a love story, keeping alive a connection between divine and mortal that transcended death itself. The flower that remembers, symbol and meaning. The hyacinth flower, born from the blood of the dying prince and the tears of a grieving god, became one of the most potent symbols in Greek mythology. But this raises a question that has puzzled scholars for centuries. Which flower, exactly, are we talking about? The modern flower we call hyacinth, the Hyacinthus orientalis, with its clusters of fragrant blooms, is actually native to the Eastern Mediterranean and Asia Minor, and was not the flower the ancient Greeks knew by this name. The flower that Apollo created from Hyacinthus's blood was most likely what we now call the martagon lily, or possibly the iris. These flowers are native to Greece and match the ancient descriptions much better than the modern hyacinth. The deep purple or blue coloring mentioned in the sources, the marks on the petals that resembled the letters AIAI, the form of the flower with its recurved petals. All of these details suggest a flower different from what we now call hyacinth. Over time, through linguistic shifts and changes in botanical classification, the name became associated with a different plant. But the symbolic power of the flower remained unchanged. The ancient descriptions emphasize the color above all else, a deep, rich purple that bordered on black, the color of royalty and mourning combined. Purple in the ancient world was the most expensive dye, extracted laboriously from sea snails, affordable only to the very wealthy and powerful. For a flower to naturally display this color made it precious and special. That this purple arose from Hyacinthus's blood gave it additional sacred significance, marking it as a flower unlike any other. A flower that carried within it the memory of divine love and tragic loss. The marks on the flower's petals interpreted as Ai Ai, the Greek cry of lament, transformed the flower into a living text, a natural inscription that told its own story. Every person who saw the flower and recognized these marks was reminded of the tragedy that had brought it into being. In a largely oral culture, where stories were passed down through telling and retelling, this physical reminder helped preserve the tale of Apollo and Hyacinthus. The flower itself became a storyteller, wordlessly communicating grief and remembrance to all who encountered it. The seasonal nature of the hyacinth added another layer of meaning. Like all flowers, it bloomed for a limited time and then faded, dying back to the ground. But unlike many plants, it returned each year, emerging anew from its bulb each spring with the same vibrant color and distinctive markings. This cycle of death and rebirth made the flower a perfect symbol for the story it commemorated. Hyacinthus had died, but he returned each year in floral form, suggesting that death was not the absolute end, that beauty could be renewed, that love could transcend even mortality. This theme of death and rebirth connected the hyacinth to broader Greek religious concepts about the cycle of seasons and the fertility of the earth. Many Greek myths dealt with vegetation deities who died and were reborn, symbolizing the agricultural cycle on which human survival depended. Persephone descended to the underworld each fall and returned each spring, bringing the growing season with her. Adonis died and was mourned by Aphrodite, but he too returned cyclically. Hyacinthus fit into this pattern, his story another variation on the theme of the beautiful youth who dies too soon, but whose death brings forth new life. The hyacinth flower also became associated with the broader symbolism of flowers in Greek culture. Flowers represented the fleeting nature of beauty, the way that the most lovely things are often the most transient. This concept, called the flower of youth, was a common motif in Greek poetry and philosophy. Young people in their prime were compared to flowers in full bloom, perfect but impermanent, destined to fade even as they were being admired. Hyacinthus himself embodied this concept, his extraordinary beauty cut off in its prime, preserved in memory precisely because it never had the chance to fade naturally with age. The flower's fragrance, sweet and heady, was said to carry a note of sadness, a complexity that reflected its origins in both love and grief. Greek poets would write of how the scent of hyacinths could evoke tears, could bring to mind the tragedy of the beautiful prince. This emotional dimension of the flower made it popular for funerary contexts, where it could serve as a reminder of the deceased's beauty while also acknowledging the sorrow of loss. In art and literature, the hyacinth became a shorthand for doomed youth and divine love. Poets would invoke the flower when writing about young men who died before their time. Artists would include hyacinths in scenes depicting Apollo, or in images meant to evoke the relationship between gods and mortals. The flower appeared on pottery, in frescoes, woven into garlands for ritual occasions. It became so closely associated with the story that simply showing the flower would bring the entire myth to mind for anyone familiar with Greek culture. The transformation of Hyacinthus into the flower also reflected ancient Greek ideas about apotheosis and memorialization. When mortals died, they typically descended to the shadowy underworld of Hades, existing as pale shades with little consciousness or agency. But exceptional mortals, heroes, those loved by gods, individuals who had done great deeds, could achieve something more. They might become minor deities, or be placed among the stars as constellations, or be transformed into natural features like springs, trees, or flowers. These transformations were a form of immortality, allowing the mortal to continue existing in a changed form, to remain part of the world rather than fading into the darkness of death. Hyacinthus's transformation into a flower was thus a gift, a form of immortalization that allowed his beauty to persist even after his death. Every spring, he would bloom again, young and beautiful forever, never aging, never truly dying. It was not the immortality of godhood, but it was a preservation of essence, a way of cheating complete oblivion. And because Apollo had caused this transformation, it was also a demonstration of the god's power and his devotion, proof that divine love could leave permanent marks on the world. The story of the flower's creation also served as an etiological myth, explaining the origin of a familiar, natural phenomenon. Ancient Greeks loved these explanatory tales, stories that told why certain flowers existed, why constellations had particular shapes, why rivers followed specific courses. The hyacinth flower, with its distinctive color and markings, demanded explanation, and the story of Apollo and Hyacinthus provided it. Every time someone saw the flower and wondered at its appearance, the myth offered an answer, weaving natural observation together with religious narrative. In modern times, the hyacinth has retained some of its symbolic associations, though the specific myth is less widely known. The flower still represents remembrance, particularly of those who died young. In the Victorian language of flowers, where different blooms carried specific meanings, the hyacinth symbolized sorrow and the desire for forgiveness, echoing its mythological origins in tragedy and grief. The flower continues to be popular in spring gardens, prized for its fragrance and vibrant colors. And though most people who plant hyacinths today don't know the story of the Spartan prince, the flower still carries within it that ancient tale of love and loss, the eternal grief, Apollo's unending mourning. Unlike mortals, who eventually heal from even the deepest wounds, who gradually learn to live with loss and find new joy after tragedy, Apollo's grief for Hyacinthus never truly ended. As an immortal, he could not forget, could not have his memories fade with time as mortal memories do. Every detail of that fatal day remained perfectly preserved in his divine mind. The warmth of the sun, the softness of the grass, the weight of the discus, the sound of impact, the look in Hyacinthus's eyes as life left them. For Apollo, the tragedy was eternally present, a wound that could never fully heal, because time, which heals mortal wounds, had no power over divine consciousness. The sources tell us that Apollo never truly got over the loss of Hyacinthus. While he would have other loves, other relationships with both mortals and immortals, none of them would quite match what he had shared with the Spartan prince. Hyacinthus remained the standard against which all others were measured, the great love that defined Apollo's understanding of what love could be. This was not because Hyacinthus was somehow objectively superior to all of Apollo's other lovers, but because of the circumstances of his death, the tragedy that had elevated their relationship from a happy romance into an eternal legend. In his grief, Apollo transformed. The god who had been known for his radiance, his joy in music, and athletic excellence, developed a darker, more melancholy aspect. His music, which had always been beautiful, now carried an undertone of sadness, a complexity born from genuine suffering. When he played his lyre, even the most cheerful tunes contained hints of sorrow, echoes of that lament he had played at Hyacinthus's funeral. This new depth in his music made it even more powerful, more affecting, because it came from authentic emotion rather than mere technical skill. Apollo's role as the god of prophecy took on new dimensions as well. He who could see the future, who had perhaps known, even as he fell in love, what the ultimate outcome would be, now bore the burden of foresight more heavily. Did he regret not acting on his prophetic knowledge, not taking measures to prevent the tragedy? Or had he known that some things cannot be prevented, that fate will find its way no matter what precautions are taken? The sources suggest that Apollo's experience with Hyacinthus made him more empathetic to mortals who came to his oracle seeking to understand or avert their own fates, for he understood from personal experience how helpless one could feel in the face of destiny. The god's relationship with other mortals was also affected. He became more protective, more aware of mortal fragility. His later loves show evidence of this, with Apollo often trying to shield his beloved from harm, to prevent repeats of the tragedy that had taken Hyacinthus from him. This protectiveness was not always successful, and sometimes it even contributed to problems, but it demonstrated how deeply the loss had marked him. Apollo's anger at what had happened also manifested in ways both subtle and overt. Though he apparently never discovered Zephyrus's role in the tragedy, his relationship with the wind gods became noticeably cooler. He had always been associated with calm, clear weather, with the bright skies that allowed prophecy and music to flourish. After Hyacinthus's death, this preference seemed to intensify. Apollo became associated with the bringing of favorable winds, with the calming of storms, perhaps unconsciously working against the wind gods who represented forces that could not be controlled, that could interfere and destroy despite all precautions. The laurel wreath that Apollo wore, originally adopted after his pursuit of Daphne, had ended with her transformation into a laurel tree, now took on additional significance. Some sources suggest he began weaving hyacinth flowers into these crowns when they were in season, creating a wreath that combined the memories of two great loves, two transformations, two reminders of mortality's power to frustrate even divine desire. The laurel represented a love that had fled from him. The hyacinth represented a love that had been taken from him. Together, they crowned the god of light with symbols of loss and longing. Apollo's sacred spaces began to feature hyacinth flowers prominently. At Delphi, at Delos, at his various temples and sanctuaries across the Greek world, priests made sure to plant and maintain hyacinth beds, ensuring that the flowers would bloom each year as a living memorial. These gardens became pilgrimage sites in their own right, places where people would come to leave offerings not to Apollo, but to the memory of Hyacinthus, recognizing that honoring the beloved was a way of honoring the god who had loved him. The annual cycle of the seasons took on new meaning for Apollo. Each spring, when the hyacinths bloomed, he was reminded anew of what he had lost. Each summer, when the festival of the Hyacinthia was celebrated, he would descend to participate in the celebrations, his presence a bittersweet reminder of why the festival existed. These annual observances kept the wound fresh, prevented him from ever truly moving past the grief. But perhaps he didn't want to move past it. Perhaps the pain was valuable to him precisely because it kept Hyacinthus alive in his consciousness, ensured that he would never forget what they had shared. The other gods watched Apollo's mourning with various reactions. Some, like his sister Artemis, offered sympathy and support, understanding that love made even immortals vulnerable to suffering. Others, like Aphrodite, who presided over love in all its forms, saw Apollo's grief as validation of love's power, proof that even the most rational and controlled of gods could be undone by matters of the heart. Zeus, Apollo's father, watched with the complicated emotions of a parent seeing their child suffer, unable to fix the problem, but wanting somehow to help. But there was also a sense among the Olympians that Apollo's grief was somehow unseemly, that his extended mourning was excessive for a god. Immortals were supposed to be above such things, supposed to be able to enjoy their pleasures without becoming too attached. Apollo's visible, ongoing pain challenged this assumption, suggested that perhaps the gods were not as different from mortals as they liked to believe. His grief made the other gods uncomfortable because it reminded them of their own vulnerabilities, their own capacity for loss. Apollo's role as a healing god took on tragic irony after Hyacinthus's death. He who could heal almost any ailment, who knew the properties of every herb and the cure for every disease, had been powerless to heal the one person who mattered most to him. This failure haunted him, colored his approach to healing. Some sources suggest that Apollo became more dedicated to his medical arts after losing Hyacinthus, as if by healing others he could somehow atone for his inability to save his beloved. He taught the art of medicine to mortals, most famously to Asclepius, who would become such a skilled healer that he could even raise the dead, until Zeus struck him down for overstepping the boundaries between mortal and immortal. Was Apollo trying to create someone who could do what he could not? A healer who might have saved Hyacinthus? The sources don't explicitly say this, but the timing is suggestive. Apollo's investment in the development of medical knowledge intensified after his loss, as if he was determined that others should not suffer similar helplessness in the face of preventable death. The god's relationships with his various oracles and prophets also bore the mark of his experience. He understood better than most gods what it meant to know the future and be unable to change it, to see disaster approaching and feel powerless to prevent it. This understanding made him sometimes gentler with those who came seeking prophecies, more willing to couch his predictions in ambiguous terms that left room for hope, even when he knew the ultimate outcome was fixed. He had learned that sometimes not knowing is a mercy, that full knowledge of the future can be a burden too heavy to bear. Apollo's music became his primary outlet for processing his grief. He would play for hours, composing new melodies that tried to capture what he had felt and lost. These compositions were considered some of his finest work, pieces that could move listeners to tears, even without knowing their inspiration. The music carried within it all the complexity of his emotions: joy at having known Hyacinthus, sorrow at losing him, anger at fate's cruelty, gratitude for the time they had shared, and an aching loneliness that never quite went away. In his role as the god of poetry, Apollo inspired countless works about loss and longing, about love that transcends death, about beauty that endures despite impermanence. Mortal poets who called upon Apollo for inspiration found themselves drawn to these themes, channeling something of the god's own grief into their verses. The entire tradition of elegiac poetry, verses written in mourning for the dead, drew power from Apollo's ongoing sorrow. Every poem written about lost love, every lament for youth cut short, every meditation on mortality carried an echo of Apollo's grief for Hyacinthus. Some sources suggest that Apollo's experience with Hyacinthus fundamentally changed his understanding of what it meant to be a god. Before, he had understood immortality as simply the way things were, the natural state of divine beings. But after losing Hyacinthus, he began to see immortality as both blessing and curse. The blessing was obvious. He would never age, never sicken, never die. But the curse was equally clear. He would live forever with his losses, would accumulate sorrows across millennia, with no prospect of the forgetfulness that death brings to mortals. Every love would eventually end. Every mortal he cared for would eventually die, and he would remember all of it forever. This realization created a profound loneliness in Apollo. He remained one of the most social of the gods, involved in mortal affairs, taking lovers both divine and mortal. But there was a part of him that held back now, that couldn't fully commit, because he knew that commitment meant eventual pain. Hyacinthus had taught him that love's intensity was directly proportional to the suffering that followed its loss. The deeper the connection, the more devastating the loss. Some part of Apollo wished he could unlearn this lesson, could return to the innocence he'd possessed before that terrible day in the meadow outside Sparta. Yet, despite the pain, Apollo never regretted having loved Hyacinthus. He never wished he had protected his heart by never caring in the first place. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of their story, that love is worth the risk of loss, that it's better to love deeply and grieve deeply than never to love at all. Apollo, with all his divine wisdom and prophetic knowledge, chose love even knowing it would end in sorrow. And even afterward, with full knowledge of the price love demanded, he would choose to love again, demonstrating that some things are worth suffering for, that connection and meaning matter more than the preservation of invulnerability. The eternal nature of Apollo's grief also served as a comfort to mortals who mourned their own losses. Here was a god, powerful and radiant, who suffered as they suffered, who understood their pain not abstractly, but intimately. When they prayed to Apollo about their own sorrows, when they sought his help in dealing with loss, they could be confident that he truly understood, that he had walked the same dark paths they were walking. His continued mourning for Hyacinthus validated their own grief, gave them permission to take as much time as they needed to heal, showed them that holding on to love, even after loss, was not weakness, but strength. In some of the later traditions, particularly those influenced by philosophical schools that emphasized the continuity of souls, there are hints that Apollo and Hyacinthus would be reunited somehow in the afterlife, or that Hyacinthus's soul had been elevated to something approaching divine status, allowing the two to be together in some form. These versions provide a happier ending, a consolation that suggests that not even death can permanently separate those who truly love each other. Whether these later additions to the myth reflect genuine ancient beliefs or are wishful thinking by storytellers who wanted to soften the tragedy, they speak to a universal human desire for love to transcend even the final boundary of death. Legacy in art and literature. A story that endures. The story of Apollo and Hyacinthus captured the imagination of artists and writers from ancient times through the present day, inspiring countless works across multiple media and cultures. This enduring appeal speaks to the universal themes embedded in the myth: the intensity of first love, the tragedy of potential unfulfilled, the randomness of fate, and the attempt to find meaning and beauty even in loss. In ancient Greek pottery, the myth appears with surprising frequency. Vase paintings show Apollo and Hyacinthus together in various scenes, exercising in the palaestra, Apollo teaching Hyacinthus to play the lyre, the tragic moment of the discus accident, and Apollo mourning over the dying prince. These visual representations served multiple purposes. They decorated functional objects used in daily life. They told stories to both literate and illiterate audiences, and they kept cultural memory alive by providing visual prompts for oral storytelling. One particularly famous example is a red figure vase from the 5th century BCE, showing Apollo and Hyacinthus in an intimate moment, the god's hand gently touching the prince's face in a gesture of tenderness and affection. The artist captured something private and genuine in this moment, a glimpse of the relationship behind the tragedy. Other vases show the athletic scenes, emphasizing the physical beauty of both figures, the perfection of their forms captured in the idolized style of classical Greek art. Sculptors also found inspiration in the myth. Statues of Apollo often included hyacinth flowers as attributes, linking the god permanently to his lost love. Representations of Hyacinthus himself, though less common, emphasized his youth and beauty, often showing him in athletic poses or in the moment of transformation into the flower. These sculptures served as devotional objects in temples and sanctuaries, as public art in civic spaces, and as private possessions for wealthy collectors who wanted to surround themselves with beauty and story. In literature, the myth appears in various ancient sources, each adding its own emphasis or interpretation. Ovid's Metamorphoses, written in the early 1st century CE, provides one of the most complete and emotionally resonant versions of the story. Ovid was a master of sympathetic storytelling, and his account emphasizes the genuine love between Apollo and Hyacinthus, the horror of the accident, and the pathos of Apollo's desperate attempts to save his beloved. Ovid's version has been incredibly influential, shaping how later ages understood and retold the myth. Earlier Greek poets also referenced the story. Euripides mentions it in several of his plays, using it as a parallel to other tales of tragic youth or divine love. The Hellenistic poets, working in the centuries after Alexander the Great, found the combination of beauty, love, and tragedy particularly appealing to their aesthetic sensibilities. They wrote elegies and epigrams that explored different aspects of the myth, sometimes focusing on the flower, sometimes on the festival, sometimes on the emotional dynamics of the relationship itself. The myth also appears in ancient hymns and religious poetry. The Homeric hymns, a collection of ancient Greek religious poetry, include references to Apollo that allude to Hyacinthus, though these mentions are often subtle, assuming audience familiarity with the full story. These religious texts demonstrate how deeply embedded the myth was in Greek spiritual life, how it functioned not just as entertainment, but as genuine religious narrative that shaped worship and belief. As Greek culture spread throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, following Alexander's conquests and the subsequent Hellenistic period, the story of Apollo and Hyacinthus traveled with it. Roman poets and artists adopted the myth, as they adopted so much of Greek culture, adapting it to their own sensibilities. In Roman art, the story often appears with slightly different emphasis, sometimes focusing more on the transformation itself, the magical moment when blood becomes flower, than on the relationship that preceded it. During the Renaissance, when European scholars and artists rediscovered and embraced classical learning, the myth of Apollo and Hyacinthus enjoyed a revival. Renaissance painters found in the story an opportunity to depict ideal male beauty, to explore themes of love and loss, and to demonstrate their mastery of classical subject matter. Paintings from this period often show the moment of transformation, with Hyacinthus's body surrounded by emerging flowers, while Apollo looks on in grief and wonder. Notable Renaissance works include paintings by artists such as Jacopo Tintoretto and Sebastiano Ricci, who created dramatic compositions centered on the tragic moment of death or transformation. These works emphasized the emotional intensity of the scene, using light, color, and composition to create powerful visual narratives. The Renaissance interest in classical mythology meant that educated viewers would have been familiar with the story, able to read and appreciate the artistic interpretations and innovations. The Baroque period continued this fascination, with artists like Giovanni Battista Tiepolo creating grand, theatrical interpretations of the myth. Baroque sensibilities favored drama, emotion, and movement, all of which the Apollo and Hyacinthus story provided in abundance. Tiepolo's version, in particular, captures the dynamic moment of the accident with a sense of motion and energy that makes the viewer feel present at the tragedy. In literature, the myth continued to inspire poets and writers. During the Romantic period, with its emphasis on intense emotion, tragic beauty, and the sublime power of nature, the story of Apollo and Hyacinthus found new resonance. Romantic poets saw in the myth a perfect expression of their own values, the intensity of feeling that transcends rational control, the beauty of youth and its inevitable loss, the transformation of personal emotion into natural beauty through the creation of the flower. The 19th century saw numerous poetic treatments of the theme. Poets wrote sonnets and longer works exploring different aspects of the myth, sometimes focusing on Apollo's grief, sometimes on Hyacinthus's innocence, sometimes on the jealousy of Zephyrus, and sometimes on the consolation offered by the flower's annual return. These works often used the classical myth as a framework for exploring contemporary concerns about love, loss, and mortality. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the myth has continued to inspire creative work across multiple media. Modern poets have found in the story themes that resonate with contemporary concerns, the vulnerability of youth, the pain of losing someone before their time, the way that memory keeps the dead alive, and the consolation offered by art and beauty. The myth has been retold in novels, adapted for theater, referenced in films, and reimagined in countless ways. Contemporary artists have also engaged with the myth, often bringing new perspectives and interpretations. Some modern versions emphasize the relationship between Apollo and Hyacinthus as a same-sex love story, exploring themes of queer identity and desire that were implicit in the original, but not always foregrounded in earlier retellings. These interpretations recognize that the story has always been about love between males and celebrate that aspect rather than minimizing it. The myth has also influenced musical compositions. Several composers have created works based on the story, from operas to orchestral pieces to songs. The combination of Apollo's identity as the god of music with the inherently dramatic and emotional narrative makes the myth particularly suitable for musical treatment. These compositions often emphasize the emotional journey from joy to tragedy to bittersweet remembrance, using music to convey feelings that words alone cannot capture. In popular culture, the myth continues to appear in various forms. Young adult novels retelling Greek myths frequently include versions of the Apollo and Hyacinthus story, making it accessible to new generations of readers. Comics and graphic novels have adapted the myth, using visual storytelling to capture both the beauty and the tragedy. Even video games exploring Greek mythology often include references to or versions of the story, allowing players to engage with the myth in interactive ways. The enduring appeal of the myth across so many centuries and cultures suggests that it touches on something fundamental in human experience. The story speaks to anyone who has loved and lost, who has seen potential unfulfilled, who has struggled to find meaning in tragedy. It acknowledges that love makes us vulnerable, but insists that this vulnerability is worth accepting, because the alternative, a life without deep connection, is emptier and sadder than a life that includes both profound joy and profound sorrow. The artistic legacy of Apollo and Hyacinthus is not just a record of how the story has been retold, but a demonstration of the myth's continuing vitality. Each new artistic interpretation adds something to our understanding, explores a different facet of the narrative, and ensures that the story remains relevant to new audiences. The myth is not a dead thing, preserved in ancient texts, but a living tradition that continues to grow and change, to speak to new generations about eternal themes. Themes and meanings. What the myth teaches. the story of Apollo and Hyacinthus operates on multiple levels, offering insights into Greek culture and values, while also exploring universal human experiences that transcend any particular time or place. To fully appreciate the myth, we need to examine the various themes it contains and consider what lessons or truths it might have been meant to convey. At its most basic level, the myth is about the impermanence of beauty and youth. Hyacinthus represents the peak of physical perfection, a young man at the height of his beauty, strength, and potential. But this perfection is fragile, vulnerable to chance and a circumstance. The discus that kills him is not wielded by an enemy or a punishment from the gods, but is simply an accident, or at most the result of jealousy from an unexpected source. This randomness emphasizes a fundamental truth that the Greeks understood well. No matter how beautiful, how strong, how talented someone might be, mortality makes everyone vulnerable. Death can come at any moment, striking down the young and beautiful as easily as the old and infirm. This theme would have resonated deeply with Greek audiences. In a world without modern medicine, where injury and disease could kill swiftly, where war was a constant threat, the fragility of life was not an abstract concept, but a daily reality. The myth of Hyacinthus gave this reality narrative form, creating a story that honored beauty while acknowledging its impermanence. The transformation into a flower provided some consolation, suggesting that beauty, while it cannot last in its original form, can be renewed in different ways. The myth also explores the limitations of divine power. Apollo, despite being a god, despite possessing healing knowledge and prophetic abilities, cannot save Hyacinthus. This is a significant statement within Greek mythology. The gods were powerful, but not omnipotent. They had their own limitations, their own areas where their will could be frustrated. Even Zeus, the king of the gods, could not simply overturn the decisions of the fates. This recognition of divine limitation made the gods more relatable, more like amplified humans than like the all-powerful deity of monotheistic religions. Apollo's inability to save Hyacinthus demonstrates that even gods must accept loss, must learn to live with grief and regret. This would have been oddly comforting to ancient Greeks facing their own losses. If even the gods could not prevent death, then mortal inability to do so was not a personal failure, but a fundamental feature of existence. The best that could be done was to honor the dead, to keep their memory alive, and to find ways to transform grief into something beautiful or meaningful. The relationship between Apollo and Hyacinthus itself carries important cultural meanings. In ancient Greece, relationships between older men and younger men were socially recognized and, within certain parameters, accepted. These relationships often had an educational component, with the older partner serving as mentor to the younger. But the myth of Apollo and Hyacinthus goes beyond this conventional framework. Their relationship is characterized by genuine mutual affection, by equality of feeling, if not of power or status, by shared joy in each other's company. Apollo's willingness to abandon his divine responsibilities to spend time with Hyacinthus suggests that their connection transcended conventional social categories. This was not simply mentorship or casual romance, but something deeper, something that the god valued more than his official duties. The myth, thus, validates the importance of personal relationships, suggesting that individual connections can be more important than social roles or responsibilities. The jealousy of Zephyrus introduces themes of desire, rejection, and violence. Zephyrus represents the dark side of love. What happens when desire is denied and affection is not returned? His actions demonstrate how love can become toxic when it focuses on possession rather than on the beloved's happiness. This theme has obvious moral implications. The myth warns against allowing jealousy to control one's actions, shows the terrible consequences that can follow from acting on wounded pride and thwarted desire. Yet the myth does not simplify this theme into a straightforward moral lesson. Zephyrus is not presented as purely evil, and in some versions, his role is minimized or eliminated entirely, leaving the death as pure accident. This ambiguity suggests that the Greeks understood jealousy as a complex emotion, neither wholly condemnable nor easily controllable. The myth acknowledges the reality of jealousy while condemning the actions that might follow from it. The creation of the hyacinth flower speaks to themes of transformation and immortalization. In Greek mythology, transformation is often a form of escape or preservation. Daphne becomes a laurel tree to escape Apollo's pursuit. Niobe becomes stone, frozen in her grief. Hyacinthus becomes a flower, his beauty preserved in a new form. These transformations suggest that the essence of a person, what makes them truly themselves, can survive even the death of the body. This idea offers comfort in the face of mortality, suggesting that death is not absolute annihilation, but a change of form. The annual blooming of the hyacinth flower introduces the theme of cyclical renewal. Unlike human death, which is final and irreversible, the flower dies back each year only to return the following spring. This cycle mirrors the agricultural cycles so important to ancient societies, the planting and harvest that determined survival. By linking Hyacinthus to this cycle, the myth suggests that death is not the end, but part of a larger pattern of death and rebirth that governs all of nature. This connection to natural cycles gave the myth religious significance beyond its narrative appeal. Hyacinthus becomes a vegetation deity of sorts, a figure whose death and rebirth symbolizes the death and rebirth of crops. This is why the Hyacinthia festival, while mourning a death, ultimately celebrates renewal and life. The first day's mourning acknowledges loss, but the following day's celebration affirms that life continues, that joy is possible even after tragedy, that renewal follows death as surely as spring follows winter. The myth also explores the theme of memory and how we honor the dead. Apollo ensures that Hyacinthus will not be forgotten, that his name will be remembered, his beauty celebrated, his story told. The creation of the flower, the establishment of the festival, and the ongoing artistic representations of the myth all serve this purpose of keeping memory alive. This reflects a deeply Greek concern with achieving lasting fame, with being remembered after death. The Greeks believed that as long as someone was remembered, spoken about, honored, they retained a kind of existence. True death was not when the body stopped functioning, but when the last person who remembered you also died. By creating permanent memorials to Hyacinthus, Apollo gave his beloved a form of immortality that even Hades could not claim. Every spring, when the flowers bloomed, Hyacinthus lived again in memory. Every summer, when the Hyacinthia was celebrated, his story was retold. Every time a poet invoked his name or an artist depicted his beauty, Hyacinthus existed in that moment of remembrance. This is perhaps the greatest gift one being can give another, the promise of being remembered, of not disappearing completely into the darkness. The myth ultimately affirms that love is worth the risk of loss. Apollo, despite his grief, never regrets having loved Hyacinthus. The relationship, brief as it was, brought joy and meaning that outlasted the pain of its ending. This is a profound statement about values and priorities. The myth suggests that a life lived safely, avoiding deep connections to prevent the pain of loss, is less valuable than a life that embraces love despite knowing that loss is inevitable. It is better to love and lose than never to love at all. Better to risk grief than to live without connection. This message has resonated across millennia because it speaks to fundamental human questions about how to live meaningfully in a world where death is certain. The myth of Apollo and Hyacinthus does not offer easy answers or false comfort. It acknowledges that tragedy is real, that loss is painful, that some wounds never fully heal. But it also insists that beauty, love, and connection matter, that they give life meaning, even when that meaning comes at the cost of eventual sorrow. Conclusion: a love that transcends time. As we come to the end of this exploration of Apollo and Hyacinthus, we find ourselves returned to where we began, in ancient Sparta, in a meadow where blood stained the grass and gave birth to flowers, where a god learned the limits of his power and a prince achieved immortality through transformation. But we understand the story now in all its complexity, have traced its threads through art and literature, through festival and flower, through grief that echoes across millennia. The tale of Apollo and Hyacinthus is not a simple story with a clear moral. It does not offer us easy lessons about how to live or what to believe. Instead, it presents us with the full complexity of love and loss, beauty and death, divine power, and mortal vulnerability. It asks us to sit with uncomfortable truths, that the things we love most are often most fragile, that even the most powerful cannot always protect those they care for, that jealousy can destroy what it cannot possess, that beauty is both eternal and heartbreakingly temporary. But the story also offers consolations. It shows us that love, even when it ends in tragedy, has value in itself. The joy that Apollo and Hyacinthus shared, the connection they forged, the beauty of their relationship, none of that was negated by its ending. If anything, the tragedy makes their love more poignant, more memorable, more worthy of being preserved in story and song. The myth tells us that it is possible to honor loss without being consumed by it, to mourn deeply while still affirming life, to remember the dead while continuing to engage with the living. The transformation of Hyacinthus into a flower provides an image of consolation that has lost none of its power across the centuries. When we see flowers pushing up through the earth in spring, when we witness the annual miracle of renewal and rebirth, we are participating in the same cycle that gave the ancient Greeks hope in the face of mortality. The flowers tell us that endings are not always final, that beauty can return, that what seems lost forever might bloom again in a different form. The endurance of this myth across thousands of years testifies to its continued relevance. Each generation finds something in it that speaks to their own experiences and concerns. Ancient Spartans saw it as a founding myth of their city, a story that connected them to the divine and explained their customs. Renaissance artists found in it an opportunity to explore ideal beauty and tragic emotion. Romantic poets used it to express their understanding of love's intensity and impermanence. Modern audiences recognize in it themes of grief, memory, and the struggle to find meaning in loss. The story has been particularly significant for those who find resonance in its depiction of love between males. In cultures and time periods where such love was celebrated, the myth was told straightforwardly, its romantic core unquestioned. In times and places where such relationships were condemned or hidden, the story sometimes survived in sanitized forms, its essential character obscured or denied. But the myth has outlasted these suppressions, and in our own time, it can again be recognized for what it always was: a love story, profound and tragic, between a god and a mortal man. What makes Apollo and Hyacinthus different from many other Greek myths is the purity of the love at its center. This is not a story of pursuit and conquest, not a tale of a divine whim or mortal punishment. Apollo and Hyacinthus chose each other, delighted in each other, shared genuine companionship and affection. Their relationship represents what love can be at its best: mutual, joyful, enriching to both partners. The tragedy is not punishment for moral failing, but simply terrible luck, the kind of random accident that can destroy anyone's happiness regardless of their virtue or worth. This randomness, this lack of cosmic justice or clear moral causation, makes the myth feel more authentic, more true to actual human experience than stories where tragedy follows logically from sin or error. Bad things happen to good people. The worthy suffer. The beautiful die young. These are hard truths, but the myth does not flinch from them. It presents reality as it is, not as we might wish it to be, and then shows us how people, mortal and immortal alike, cope with these realities. Through grief and remembrance, through transformation and art, through festivals that blend mourning with celebration, through stories that keep the dead alive in memory. The hyacinth flowers, blooming purple in the spring, continue to carry their message across the centuries. They speak of love and loss, of beauty and mortality, of a god's grief and a mortal's transformation. They connect us to the ancient past, to the people who first told this story, to the countless generations who have retold it, adapted it, found meaning in it. When we see hyacinth flowers, Whether we consciously think of the myth or not, we are participating in a chain of memory and meaning that stretches back to the earliest days of Greek culture. The story of Apollo and Hyacinthus reminds us that mythology is not just ancient history, not just entertaining stories from a dead culture, but living tradition that continues to speak to fundamental human concerns. The gods and heroes of Greek myth were never meant to be worshipped from a distance, but to provide models for understanding our own lives, mirrors in which we could see our own experiences reflected and perhaps better understood. In Apollo's grief, we recognize our own sorrows. In Hyacinthus's beauty and vulnerability, we see the fragility of everything we treasure. In the transformation of blood to flowers, we find hope that loss can be transformed into something beautiful, that memory itself is a form of immortality, that love creates echoes that persist long after the lovers themselves have gone. As we drift toward sleep, letting this story settle in our consciousness, we can take comfort in its endurance. For thousands of years, people have told this tale, have found in it something worth preserving and passing on. The story has survived the fall of empires, the change of religions, countless cultural transformations. It has survived because it speaks truly about love and loss, because it honors both the joy of connection and the pain of separation, because it refuses to simplify or sanitize the messy reality of living and loving in a world where nothing lasts forever except the stories we tell about what mattered to us. So let the story of Apollo and Hyacinthus accompany you into dreams. Let it remind you that love is always worth the risk, that beauty matters even when it's fleeting, that grief is the price we pay for connection and is therefore not something to be avoided, but something to be honored. Let it remind you that we are all in the kokra and, like Hyacinthus, mortal, vulnerable, beautiful for a time, and capable of being transformed by love into something that endures beyond our brief lives. If you enjoyed this journey through myth and meaning, if this story of divine love and tragic loss resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Myths of the Night. Your support helps us continue exploring the ancient stories that still have so much to teach us about what it means to be human, to love, to lose, and to find beauty even in grief. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with spring flowers and remembered love.